Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, good whatever time it is, wherever you are in this amazing planet of ours. I am Malcolm Hawker, and I'm the host of the CDO Matters Podcast. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching on YouTube. However you are consuming the content, I'm thrilled to have you join us today. Today, we are going to talk all about data architecture. And I am super happy that Pete Cooney has decided to join us today. Pete is the lead data architect at Jackson. Pete, welcome.
Thank you.
What is the old name of Jackson for people who may remember it as a different name?
Yeah, our name historically has been Jackson National Life, and we got our start as a life insurance company. We're now one of the leaders in the annuity business, and then we're bringing out new insurance-based retirement products for folks all the time. So talk to your financial advisor about us. So
awesome. Well, thanks for joining and taking time out of your busy schedule to be here.
Thank you.
All right. Well, let's get into it. We're gonna talk about data architecture today, and I feel like I maybe need to apologize in advance. It is early March as we record this. I've just returned from 3 days at the Gartner Data and Analytics Summit in Orlando, and I'm a little hazy because I've been in just awash in all things data for 3 days. Not to mention being on my feet and working out our booth and everything, and that was a lot of fun. But I had a chance to talk to a lot of data practitioners. I had a chance to talk to a lot of data architects, and today I want to focus, Pete, on just kind of like what would a CDO need to know about data architecture? What are some of the things in the space that are kind of going on? We'll probably have to talk about AI. We're all talking about AI, but let's just kind of start high level. How would you describe a data architecture role to maybe a non-technical person?
The way I would frame it is that people put a lot of thought into how they want their applications to work because they understand that applications produce outcomes for people, right? What folks don't often as much think about is how does the data that I produce when I do my work, the data that I use to look at to help make decisions as part of my work, and the data that we use behind the scenes in our applications. How does that all play together? And people have been doing data architecture formally for decades. But for a long time, especially with the way the technology was, we thought of data architecture as something that was for developers to help them structure what they needed to do. Then somewhere in the last 15 years or so, a switch flipped, right? CDOs started coming out because your chief data officer knows that data is an asset for the business. Data can be a money maker, right? How many of the big organizations like Google and Amazon of those have shown you can make money with data? So data architecture fundamentally means how do I organize and use my data most effectively? And there are two flavors of that are complementary. One is how do you structure that data? So is there a way of organizing my data itself in context of islands of data in my world or in a big picture in an enterprise? And then the other way is what kind of technology do I use to enable maximal use of my data? Give you a good example. 15 years ago, the data warehouse was a revolutionary way of gathering data from a whole different lot of systems. But it was beginning to feel a little stale because there was a lot of effort being put into building these data warehouses, and people weren't necessarily using it for a variety of reasons. Then at that point in time, cloud technology started coming up. You started being able to talk about big data, aggregating data into, in volume, and being able to use more data in a bigger variety of ways than you were constrained to in a data warehouse. And of course, that had its own limitations too, because it lacked the structure and the security and all the good things that came with a data warehouse. And so you started seeing different models of data lakes evolving. Now you've got data lakehouse, which tries to marry both kinds of data consumption. So in data architect is ultimately here, in my mind, especially for a regulated organization like Jackson. A data architect is really here to help steer the organization in a way that will get the maximum use out of their data appropriate to their circumstance. Because as you definitely you can attest to this, having just been at the Gartner. It's not a one-size-fit-all sort of circumstance. Every organization is a little bit different. And maybe we fall into patterns, but every organization has a different take or a different need for the use of their data. And so finding the right fit is really why they would hire somebody like me and not just leave it to a committee of folks in technology.
So there's a lot of things to dive deeper on from your response.
Yeah.
But I was a little struck at the beginning when you were talking about business applications, because I think a lot of people would naturally assume, oh, okay, this is analytics. And of course, I mean, you talked about lakes, you talked about warehouses, and quite obviously that's analytics and cool. That's what I would assume kind of a data architect is doing is putting those pieces together. But you did touch on the business applications part at the beginning, which kind of gets a little bit into process optimization too, I would think necessarily. So are you playing a role in helping consult folks maybe on more the engineering side of the house and building those applications as to kind of like what data they should be capturing or how they should be configuring their applications in order to provide the right data that the organization needs?
Absolutely. In fact, one of my favorite things to talk about, so I'm glad you asked this question. One of my favorite things to talk about is the need to have the data that your systems consume and share be consistent with the data being used in analytics. It's a point of passion for me because I didn't get my start as a data warehousing guy. I got my start as a data integration guy. Enterprise data hubs and ESBs and all of that. And so I cared very much about how applications exchange data and about practical use of data day to day. And I learned how to do data modeling because of that kind of thing. And so I come at it from a different angle than a traditional data warehousing analytics support kind of person. And so I think it's really critical to have a capability like an MDM governing certain key entities of your data so that you can then share that data consistently, whether it's through an event-based operational data store that has APIs on top of it, whether it's a lake house where you have data products published and shared in your data catalog. I want the data that going through those different routes have the same level of consistency. I need to know that the customer record that I'm using in my API is the same customer record that my customer service team is looking at in a CRM. Is the same that the sales analytics teams are looking at as they're planning things. You get the idea.
Well, I would suspect that sometimes you can engineer that by design. If you're building like a custom application, perhaps, right? Like from the ground up. Like if you actually have an software engineering team and you're building stuff from the ground up, I would hope that you were at the table and making sure that the discrepancies potentially that might exist between something that you're building from the application side aren't that drastic from what you would see on the analytics side. But I think some of these things are necessarily unavoidable given most of what we use, I suspect, is out of the box, right? It's Salesforce, it's ServiceNow, it's all of these things. And it's all these business applications that we're buying from vendors where, of course, because there's no standards around metadata, all these things necessarily have different definitions. And I guess that's what you mean, or different structures or different quality metrics or
Yep.
all sorts of differences. And I guess that's what you mean by the kind of consistency across channels and the need to resolve those. Where's the best place to resolve those differences? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to peel that onion. You talked about ESBs, enterprise service buses. Usually use that phrase much anymore, do we?
No, and there's a reason for that. We were very well intentioned creating ESBs, but there's some flaws in that. That's a whole nother.
Okay. Well, we won't go down that rabbit hole maybe just yet. Yeah. But you can kind of solve for the consistency issues in an ETL, yep. Right? And I've done that where as a part of source, target, do some magic in the middle. But increasingly in some of these lakehouse-driven architectures or data lake-driven architectures, a lot of that data management is happening a little bit downstream. Do you agree?
Upstream and downstream, yes.
Okay.
And again, especially depending on whether you're talking fabric or lake or fabric or mesh, right? Mesh, they're assuming it's happening upstream.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Right. And so to get into the mesh, you're going to have a common frame. In fact, in a fabric architecture, then you get into more of a situation where you can enforce some of those rules. And I've worked at some very large organizations where they're basically tailor-made for mesh, where everybody needs to know what their marching orders are, their basic rules to get into the common ground, and then you publish it out to the common ground. Versus more my situation now, where it was more of a fabric approach, where we have some certain central kind of approaches to things that we want to use, but then we scale them so that the different functions of our business can use those effectively, right? And I think that's the key for us, is where you want that management to happen at the point of exchange. In other words, if you're using a lakehouse, ask yourself the question, what's going to feed the consumption of my data products in my lakehouse? And if what's going to feed those key data products isn't married with your key APIs or your key data sources, that's what you want, again, to bring an expert team together and say, how do we make these things married together? And so it doesn't have to be everything. Matter of fact, it's usually a minority of stuff. But how does that key stuff get tied together in a consistent way so that we can share the right data for the right job and have a common view?
Well, so you just made a business case for MDM, because not all the stuff, but the key stuff. And I use those words all the time, by the way. But the key stuff is the stuff that's used most often, I would suspect, or is at least widely shared. That's where it's most important to resolve some of those common discrepancies in data. Do you agree?
It's definitely one way of doing it. I've tried to handle this more brute force in the past, and again, and it worked. It was just a lot more work. Combining data into into a common file structure, for example, in a data lake. It's a great idea, very, very, very labor intensive, hard to get people on board and consistent. So yeah, and that's where an MDM has historically done well. And I have to say, the modern MDM, the modern cloud-based MDM, is in a much better place to deliver value in that front than you would run into in traditionally. Because I think that the big difference with the cloud-based MDM is that cloud-based MDM leverages the cloud effectively and it has the cloud components like the data lake storage, do all the heavy lifting, as it were, for some of the components that were really weighty and hard to manage in 10, 15 years ago. So it's a better option than it was. That's for sure. My favorite thing about the MDM though is the business ownership. That's really the main thing for me. I'm a big fan of business-driven data governance. Jackson has business-driven data governance with business leaders and their teams owning data, having a sense of ownership and having some responsibility, not just accountability, but responsibility for some of the management of their data. And at the end of the day, you want those people to have hands-on to resolving issues versus some well-intentioned person in technology, sitting there and making their best guess. A business analyst is no substitute for a business SME. Is a one way of phrasing it. And the business SMEs can have hands-on in using a lot of MDM tools, and that's one real strength in my mind.
So I'm a sucker for an MDM use case. So I'm in many ways, some might argue that I'm an MDM hammer looking for MDM nails, and you just handed me one. So I couldn't resist. But I did find you had opened your previous statement with something I find slightly paradoxical, and I'd love for you to explain it. That paradox, which was we were talking about discrepancies in data, differences between what exists in a business application or an operational system and an analytical system, and you said, "I've tried brute force and it's harder." That to me came across as paradoxical because I would assume, brute force, one table to rule them all. Technologically, that sounds easier, but you're suggesting that to execute it is actually harder. Why?
To make a brute force approach work well, you have to be able to scale the softer pieces of it. You have to have excellent documentation. You have to have excellent knowledge transfer. You have to have effective architecture to govern the whole thing. And I personally feel like, our architecture was quite good. And we did as good a job with the number of people we had kind of maintaining standards. But when you're working with development teams, in most organizations I've been a part of, and I've consulted for a long time before I joined Fortune 500 companies the last 10, 15 years. The most important thing you have to remember about developers is developers know what they know. People know what they know. And you're not going to be able to change their mindset unless you give them significant incentives, financial, career, real incentives. Unless you give somebody a real incentive, they're going to stick to what they know to deliver what they're supposed to deliver. And developers tend to like to build things and to learn things.
Yep.
So if you give them a framework that's hard to understand or a lot of work without apparent reward, and they're not adequately rewarded in some other way for that, then adoption is just hard to deliver. And that's really what I've seen, is that the people with the best intentions and excellent structures and well thought out designs, some of the message, could fall flat because they were missing on any one of those areas. And Jackson, we pride ourselves on delivery. We deliver high quality solutions to our customers, and we pride ourselves on innovating for our business within our four walls very, very well. And if I went to somebody and said, "Hope you have to stop everything you're doing, stop delivering value now, and follow this path," and I'm going to run into resistance, and I may not get the adoption that I want.
So it's interesting. You just touched on something that I've always known to be true. But when we talk about kind of top-down, heavy-handed approaches, I've always said, don't do them because they probably don't best fit your business need, for one, right? Because the way that sales looks at something is necessarily different than the way that finance looks at something. And putting that aside, kind of the top-down, edict-driven things are really hard from a governance perspective on the business side. To get those people who are on the business side to agree on those common definitions is awfully hard. But what you added was a very interesting and I think totally appropriate perspective, which is, who wants to be told from an engineering perspective, whether that's a data engineer or a software engineer, who wants to be told how to do their job, right? No, nobody does. And you actually eloquently kind of wove in the idea of excellence in delivery. And delivery becomes excellent when you are the best software engineer or the best data engineer or the best anything, and you are being creative and you're solving hard problems. But if you're just sitting there taking orders and cramming everything into the one single customer table to rule them all, well, I mean, you don't need a lot of creativity to do that. You don't need a lot of engineering acumen to do it either. So that's an aspect I hadn't necessarily. It makes complete sense. I just always think it's hard to do from a governance perspective because you're forcing everybody to agree. But what you're saying is that it's going to suck the life out of your engineers because you're telling them how to do their job.
Yeah, and I think that actually a central edict, if it's not treated as an edict, and I think that's let me drill on that for a second. A central initiative can work.
Right. Okay. Yep. True.
Number one, you get your creative people excited about. If you're talented people, especially your most talented people, but if you have a bunch of talented people, if you get them excited about an option and get them diving into it, then you can get a lot of value out of it. Because again, the successful kind of fabric style data fabric architectures I've seen, really people got excited about it, people became invested in it, and they built a framework that worked. Where I've seen it fail is where somebody, in mid-management or developers didn't catch the vision. And so all of this work felt like a slog. It's the difference between taking, I have a bunch of kids. And so, I have a teenager, of which I've had a bunch now. And I say to my teenager, I want you to rake the lawn. They'll go, oh no, oh wow, woe is me. If I say, I want you to rake the lawn so that we can then have your friends over and have a party. Suddenly they're incented, right? And so from my standpoint, it's about motivation. And I just, whether it's just a little bit of a do unto others kind of moment, if I want to do something, I want to be excited about the direction whenever possible. And we don't always get that luxury. But especially being in architecture, part of my job, I feel, is to get people invested in a direction and help them understand the benefit of that direction. Because if people understand why and see how it ties back to their benefit, the benefit of their organization, people will get excited. And I see that time and again. The other danger, though, in my space especially, is that sometimes these things can take a while and then fatigue sets in. And maintaining that level of excitement or maintaining consistent direction is the really hard part. That's where data warehouses tended to founder, because you get about 60% of the way into populating that Uber data warehouse, and everybody just got sick of it. And they wanted to pivot to a data lake because all of a sudden that sounded cooler. All of a sudden, we're going to stop putting data in the data lake, and we're going to do a combination data warehouse and data lake. Oh, but wait, but they still are neglecting the 20% of data that they didn't put into either. You see what I mean? So that is, by the way, what part of the genius of the lake house is that you can ultimately solve that problem, because if you can get all of those pieces into a spot where at least they can be shared somehow in the lake house, you can combine them together and use them. It still doesn't necessarily solve the consistency problem, but again, that's part of the challenge of it.
So a few things. One, I'd love to dive into the difference between a warehouse and a lake, just briefly. So, sure. but let's park that. Two, what I heard you say, this gets back to my first question of describe a data architect. What I just heard you say in my language is you need to actually be pretty good at persuasion and pretty good at sales. And yes, you need to find what incentivizes people, what motivates them. And in the case of your teenager, it was the party. But you also need to be thinking bigger picture in terms of things like scalability and future proofing where you need to go. So it can't necessarily always be just about, persuading people to do something. It's also persuading them to do something which may not be in their best interest for today, but may be for their future best interest. So there's certainly some salesmanship involved in all that. Do you agree?
I think it's not emphasized enough that part of being in leadership in the corporate life is salesmanship. Yeah. I would give credit to my dad. My dad highlighted how important sales was to me at a young age, which is why I ended up taking jobs in college, like going and passing out petitions, getting petition signatures in mall parking lots and things like that, and making much better money than I would have at Taco Bell or something like that. And ultimately, persuasion is a key aspect of corporate life. And the more responsibility you have, the more persuasion is important. And I think, if we were doing a podcast for architects, we would spend the entire time selling the value of persuasion, because too many good developers become architects and then wonder why they struggle. And it's because ultimately they want to give people instructions. Yeah. But not give them incentives. And so that's where the balance comes in. And going back to the analogy of the teenager, part of the reason that I might want my teenager to have the party in my yard is to guarantee that there's no funny business and that the right friends are coming and that this person's hanging out with the right friends, right? Fortunately, my kids tend to have good taste in friends, so I don't have to worry about that. But at the end of the day, it's one of those things where you, as an architect, want the people to pick things for the right reasons. And you don't have to be the bad guy going and saying, oh, you can't do this. No. You have to use this other thing. That's not going to, versus going and saying, well, the trouble with this is that it's insecure. Yeah. And that there's an alternative way that also, by the way, would be like 25% faster for you to develop with if you use this alternative over here, which kind of leads us to the data warehouse versus data lake in one sense. Data warehousing is ultimately about structure and consumption, in my mind. Data lakes natively are bad for structure and consumption because data lakes are for aggregation and data use and volume. If you're doing AI, you need a data lake of some kind. Even a lake house is insufficient for good AI pieces, unless you've got a really good RAG architecture. That's a topic for another time. And I don't know that a really good RAG architecture exists yet, by the way. So we'll talk to me in 5 years. But at the end of the day, you're going to need, both are important aspects of corporate life now. And that's why the lakehouse is a genius idea, because it allows you to, through a virtualization layer, access both components and have the right tools for the job. So, but the lake ultimately is a must-have for a lot of organizations, because you need to aggregate data without too much forethought or control over the structure of it. You want to have access to more data. And then that's what lake, really what I'm seeing is that lakes become the sources for data warehouses. And the data warehouses then become, you can have a few more than you used to. You don't necessarily have one big enterprise data warehouse as much as you have fit for purpose data warehouses, but then point data in a nice structured way to people who need it for more specific things. And even if you have a nice reusable data product, you can still tell people you should use this product for this, this, and this, and not use it for this and this. That's a concept that didn't exist 15 years ago with the data warehouse. With the data warehouse, we're like, we're going to build a data warehouse that everyone is going to use. It's going to be great. And then now we realize not every, like you said, sales and service and accounting don't have the same view of the world, and they shouldn't. So therefore, we can build views of the same data in a way that they can use optimally, and the data lake becomes kind of a key way that you can aggregate and make that happen.
So you had said something. You should use, I mean, you're talking about a data product, you should use it for this, but not this. That, to me, that is a data contract. Maybe. Terms of use, right?
Yep.
Which could be enforced in some idea of a data contract.
Yep.
Let me try something on you and see if it resonates. And if the answer is no, I'll totally accept that. I'm wrong often. Just ask my wife. A data warehouse supports a situation where you know the questions you're going to ask, and a data lake is where you don't necessarily know the questions you're going to ask. How does that fit? What do you think about that? Is that a useful tool to think about the differences between the two?
Yes and no.
Okay, that's a win.
Yeah. I would frame it a little bit differently. I would say data warehouses are where you would go to answer questions.
Yeah.
Data lakes are where you go to learn things,
including the questions potentially.
Including questions, especially.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And especially having spent some time in and around AI over the last 10 years, I tell you, it is necessary to have a volume of data to actually learn things. In delivering an enterprise data model, which is something I've done in recent years, which is to say a normalized model for an enterprise, you need a data lake, because you need a lot of different points to be able to develop something effective, which is counterintuitive to people who've done data warehousing, but it's true. So, and to learn about kind of the different ways that an organization functions, you can learn a lot about an organization from how they view key entities, right? If I'm doing sales, but I never refer to a person, I'm always talking about accounts, or I'm talking about SKUs. Where do people actually fit into the equation on that front? But by contrast, if I'm a manufacturer and I'm talking about my product, but I don't have explicit references to my supply chain partners, where do they fit into the picture, right? And so looking at data in a data lake context helps you understand where my organization thinks and doesn't think. And it's not necessarily good or bad, right? But it's self-awareness in a lot of ways is something I think you can get from a data lake. Whereas data warehouse, you have to have an understanding of the domain that you're going into, so you can optimize what you're seeing, what people can see, so they can read it faster. Because there's nothing worse than for a business user than trying to get some data and then having to hit a button and wait 15 minutes, right? That is just nightmarish in this day and age when they can go to their phone and ask ChatGPT and get something that resembles an answer, right, to a question, and then have to wait for their internal systems to process while they go brew another pot of coffee. And that kind of user experience driven world is why we end up with different tools for the job in a lot of circumstances. So it's the same reason I have a socket wrench and a ratchet at home, because I can remove a bolt with one or the other, but different circumstances warrant different uses of a different tool.
Got it. You had mentioned previously in a couple of other responses, you'd mentioned data products. So where do those fit from the perspective of this idea of a medallion architecture? So take a moment to describe a medallion architecture and where data products kind of fit into that, and why kind of as a CDO, I should be aware of this phenomenon.
Well, I'll answer the question with a caveat.
Okay.
So medallion architecture is essentially the situation where you take your data from various places in the format that it came in all the various different ways that the data is represented in a bronze layer. You clean it up and perform some quality improvement in this middle layer, which is a silver layer. And then you share it with people in a gold layer. And you can even talk about bronze, silver, gold, platinum type arrangements where you've got one kind of general layer of shareable things, and then you've got finer grained levels of things in the platinum layer. I think data products optimally live in the platinum layer. And I think they're managed through data governance portals, data catalogs, data marketplaces, places like that, where that curated data, that gold data is made available to people in a way that's secure and optimized for their consumption. And that's where I really like where places like Snowflake, Databricks, Microsoft with their Fabric are going with data technology now, because they're taking basically gold layers and making them super easily reusable by people. And that to me is where the data product comes in. But the other aspect of the data product, apart from its consumability, its accessibility and consumability, is the security and governance of it. As a data steward in an organization, and I believe very strongly, again, like I said, in business data stewards, as a data steward, I want to make sure that this person in this department has access to my data and this person in this department does not. Or even better, person A gets access to a view of my data that's a complete view of this data, whereas person B has columns hashed out so they can get use of most of it or the relevant data using the same data set. But because of security, they have the stuff that they don't need to know masked: social security numbers, proprietary information, that kind of thing. So I think of data products as it was a great concept for a while. It's now realizable through data governance tools, and data governance process. And I think that's the really exciting thing about that space to me, is that you can take what we've always had to brute force. Like say 10 years ago, to do data governance like this, we would have had to brute force it, unless you happen to have an MDM, which was a lot more work 10 years ago. But unless you had something like that, you had to brute force your way and kind of create a process around things. Now there are a lot of vendors who can give you that governance process out of the box and apply it against whatever kind of data structure you have, whether it's medallion data architecture, whether it's a series of legacy data warehouses, and allow you to give you control over that story and be able to curate data products and share them with people in the same way that people who sell products for a living do it, which is to say you have a package, you have a contract, and you have contents, right? That packaging and the ability to get to what you want is really key. Knowing what you're accountable to do and not to do with it, that contract, is key. And then the ability to consume it the way you want is key. And that's where these tools are, offer a lot more opportunity than we had even 5 years ago.
Awesome. Let's transition, to the favorite topic of the day, of course, AI. We've talked about a lot of things in the last 30 minutes. We talked about kind of data integration and data pipelines, although we didn't go into depth into data pipelines. We talked about analytical uses of data. We talked a little bit about operational uses of data. We talked a little bit about this persuasion factor of good architecture, warehouses, lakes. When you think about where we got to now, and kind of let's just call them pre-2022, pre-Chat GPT, like the world as we know it from an architecture and data management, data governance perspective, what do you see as some of the bigger changes, either that have already happened or that maybe need to happen through the lens of what you do, data architecture, to be better positioned to support AI? Because I don't know many people who think it's just going to go away. I don't think it's going away. So what do you think? What is going to change? What is net different about your role and about data architecture evolving over the next few years in order to best support AI?
Well, first of all, the criticality of having availability of data so that you can do something with your favorite LLM of the month or your favorite packaged solution of the month is key. So much of what we're doing with assistive AI right now is take data set, point AI data set, make data set easier to use or more consumable. And that's a great starting point. And that's spurred a lot of people to explore medallion architectures so you can expose data for things. It's where lake houses have come into play, I think, a little bit more, though. The virtualization, the use of virtualization and AI are sort of in parallel tracks. And I see that converging at some point in time because for a variety of reasons. But I think the most important thing we're going to see as AI agents come into play is the need to actually build pipelines to move data quickly from big place to big place. I think one thing that AI is going to drive is cross lake or cross lake house or cross environmental sharing. Because the premise of RAG architecture at a high level, right, and this without getting into any of the GORP behind it, and that I suspect some of the GORP is very interesting, but without getting into any of that, is a premise that this AI bot up top needs buddies to help it make a decision. And when you start getting into agents are literally the coordinators of other bots, and those bots have to have data behind them to do what they need to do, but then they need to pass things back and forth effectively. And we have the means to do that today. What we don't have are as many common patterns on how to do so effectively. And again, this is where I'm a big proponent for consistency in data, because if those back-end sources have some level of consistency and some shared rules and some shared records, then it's feasible to pass from place to place to place and pass those results along seamlessly within your agents. If you don't, then you're going to run into delays in process, the agent just simply breaking down and not being able to finish what it does because you ran into data consistency or data quality problems at one point in this, and that prevents it from being sent to another place which has rules in place or has some sort of constraint that prevents you from consuming the input from this other place. So that's where I think some of these challenges are going to come into play. I think people are going to, software application developers are going to try and get around this by building that integration into their tool. That's always the first instinct, right? If you're the big box, if you're Salesforce or SAP or somebody, you're going to try and drag it all in and have it all in your space. But that's a solution for a certain percentage of the population for which that makes sense. For the rest of us who can't afford that or don't need that, we're going to start seeing a lot of pushing the envelope on how do I make that data consistently run across these different pieces of things. Again, I kind of tongue in cheek call it multi-lake, but it may not really be multi-lake. It may be these two different applications running with Dataverse on the back end, and these two applications running with some Amazon back end, and then this data lake over here, all being able to communicate with each other effectively. We have the means. Not as many people have built it yet, but we're going to see that because of the agents, I think.
I had an aha moment listening to you. I fully and completely agree. But historically, at least over the past couple of years, I've been a little bit of a curmudgeon when it comes to data contracts and when it comes to data products, because I'm a data product, or I'm a product management. I'm like recovering product management person. and I naturally shift right. And I naturally shift towards the end user, the consumer, the person, the human that is consuming the dashboard or interfacing with the API or looking at a spreadsheet, whatever it is. I kind of lean that way. And I still think that from a operating model perspective, having the end consumer in mind is important.
Yep.
But I just had an aha, Pete. What if the end consumer is a machine?
Mm-hmm.
And if the end consumer is a machine, well, then a metadata-driven contract makes complete sense, right?
Yes.
Like when you and I download a piece of an application on our phones, and there is the "Do you agree?" Like, oh, give me a break. Of course, I agree. I just want the app, right? Like, there's always those contracts that they're the terms of service. Here's how you're supposed to use this app. Do you agree? Not agree? Yes, of course, I agree. Click, click, click. And I just ignore the contracts. When it comes to this kind of stuff. So I've found the concept of kind of data contracts from a human perspective, for lack of a better word, silly. I don't know a better word. Superfluous, unnecessary. I don't know. But machine to machine, and in the context that you just shared, which is lake to lake, if you think about that across companies,
mm-hmm.
that gets really interesting, particularly if we evolve to a place where legal cases, court cases, even arguably lawmakers get to the point of finding a way to protect intellectual property that is buried in data.
Yep.
Where it's no longer just Wild West and anybody using anything in their models, and where companies can actually kind of find ways to protect their data. It'll probably be in their best interest to monetize it, right? Somehow, some way. Today, it's through these, New York Times will license its content to ChatGPT, and the entire horse is let out of the barn. But if you could set up kind of marketplaces, machine to machine marketplaces built on contracts that are traversing lake by lake, what you described, which is the interoperability, is maybe another way to say it.
Yep.
Right. The commonality across the data, at the very least, understanding what the rules were used to create it, the governance policies used to create it. That I had an aha moment there. I've never thought of it before having this conversation about the importance of machine to machine communications and how you're going to need contracts. I just thought contracts were not that viable from a person perspective. Okay.
Yeah. And that's why when you're talking about data products, the person-facing data products, I actually like to use the distinction of data product and data service. The person will buy a product, and there's an agreement. A person will agree to something. That's an agreement. You call it a contract, people will tend to be put off a little bit.
Yeah.
But if you call it an agreement, well, okay, yeah, I get to agree. See, and so that's where I tend to frame data agreements for people, consumers, data contracts for machines, because a machine wants to know I have a necessary exchange, and so that's we don't really even talk about data contracts internally here, because ultimately we want people to agree to the governing rules and to agree to use, agree to take on a particular role security wise to use the data product that they want, and frame it that way so that people understand we're empowering them and they're agreeing. It's a mutually agreed upon relationship where we provide them, assurances of the security of what they're doing and access to what they're doing in return for them not misusing it.
All right, I'm going to need to go think for about a couple hours, because now my brain here is all of a sudden I need to maybe be more open to data contracts, because I've been a little bit of a naysayer when it comes to contracts and products. I'll be honest, like the shift left data products, but when it's all machines that are kind of doing all this stuff, I mean, I totally get it. That's the scalability that you would absolutely positively need. So, which is the heart of data architecture. So, Pete, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for carving an hour out of your day. Awesome. I'm going to be thinking for the next 2 hours because of this conversation.
Good. Glad to spend the time with you. Good to see you.
Awesome. All right. If you are still with us, if you're still listening, thank you so much. I would be absolutely thrilled if you would take the time to thumbs up or click like or subscribe or do all the things that we're supposed to do on social media when you like the content. because I would like to get some feedback that we're doing some of the right things. We keep doing this. We're going to keep creating this content because it's my mission in life to extend the 10 years of CDOs and data leaders across the world. So I hope you got some value from today's conversations. We'll be back in another 2 weeks. Oh, by the way, Pete did mention data virtualization a few times. There's an episode dropping today, March 6th, with Alberto Pan. He is the CTO of a company called Denodo. Denodo does data virtualization. So Pete mentioned it. If you want to go a little deeper on data virtualization, what that means, check out the episode that is available today, March 6th, from Alberto Pan. With Alberto Pan from Denodo, you may find that interesting. For now, I will let you go. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. And we will see you on another episode of CDO Matters sometime very soon. Thanks all. Bye for now.